Anybody's youth is difficult, but I think what was hardest about the 1950s was that everybody thought they knew exactly what they were supposed to do, and nobody wanted to do it. And that meant that there was a kind of lockstep life set up for you. You were to get married the moment you either got out of high school or got out of college. And I remember most of my friends who didn't go to college got married within a year after they got out of high school. They're probably all divorced now. And then you were to go to college for 4 years, get married, and your life was over. So in a sense, high school were the supposed to be the greatest time of your life, but there was a sense of doom. It was going to all be over after 4 years. My sense is that the pressures, there were three kinds of pressures. There were pressures from parents who were hysterical that their kids were going to become rock and rollers or listen to bad music or associate with bad people, and that was really a very serious thing. There were pressures from the not so much from the teachers, although some of them were afraid of kids, and there was lots of fear, I think, of what children were how children were behaving. You see that in Blackboard Jungle or some of the films of that era. But mostly it was school boards, and there was lots of pressure on school boards. I know that in my grade school, just before I was graduating from grade school, the local managing editor of the Chicago Tribune got all the songs removed from the school that had anything to do with the United Nations because he thought it was a communist plot. So there was that kind of pressure on the schools from the school board. There was a lot of community pressure. You were supposed to conform to some kind of ideal of childhood. That is to say, you should look like miniature adults and you shouldn't behave like children. And then there were these incredible things that kids that imposed on themselves, these dating games and going steady. There was a whole series of rituals you had to go through, and clothes that you had to wear. And all of it was sort of carefully merchandised. I mean, one of the interesting things that happens in the 1950s is the development of a youth commercial market for clothes, for objects, for food, all of which is consumed by kids and spread by television, which is beginning to become widespread at that point. I think one of the things that you did when you went to school was try not to be noticed. The most important thing was not to stand out, and there were unofficial clothing color days. There were colors you could wear on some days and colors you couldn't wear on other days. If you wore, I can't remember the color, maybe it was yellow on Thursday, it meant that you were gay. If you wore the wrong color trousers, you couldn't wear black because that meant you were a hoodlum. Hood is what we called people. So there's a whole series of unofficial rules. You could wear white bucks, which was very much in vogue. But the one thing you didn't want to do was to stand out and wear something that was out of fashion somehow. What it does is it makes you terribly worried about who you are and what you should conform to. So that we talked endlessly, some friends of mine and I talked endlessly about the word conformity, because we thought that was a terrible thing, except that that's all we ever did was to conform. And we worried about standing out, about being different, about what kind of high school fraternity or sorority you got into. That was very widespread in the 50s. There was a growth of these sort of clubs that were protective. And there were elite ones and there were not so elite ones, and everything had to do with what you belonged to and who you were and where you lived.
Sounds very restrictive. If you could, in the strongest possible terms, not necessarily about yourself, but about the society, give me a sense, just a general sense, of restrictive feelings in every area of a kid's life. It is restrictive. I mean,
well, sure, it's restrictive. It's restrictive if you don't believe in it, and the point is that nobody really, I think, believed in it. So that what happened was that kids were acting out somebody else's restrictions, not their own, although they imposed their own kinds of rules on themselves. But there was a sense of the group, a constant sense of what the group would think about what you did, and there was always somebody sort of watching you, you felt. If it wasn't the state legislature or the PTA or a parents group, it was a group of teachers or principals. In other words, there were so many authority figures that it was a very confusing time to live in, and people really telling you lots of different things. I think the 50s is a period of very mixed signals, and growing up in that kind of circumstance makes you very nervous about who you're trying to please, and we didn't quite know who we were trying to please. Certainly weren't trying to please ourselves. Well, it was in some ways it was like growing up today. That is to say, everything was sexual. All advertising, all movies, all cars. Cars looked like were modeled to look like women, if you can imagine a car looking like a woman. Everything had a sexual code to it, except that we weren't supposed to do it. And so there you were, surrounded by sexual enticements and discussions of sex, and a really a kind of incredible vision that Hollywood had created for Americans, where sex didn't happen inside marriage, but it didn't happen outside of marriage either. It was everywhere but nowhere. And in a sense, growing up in that, you just didn't know what to do. And the other thing was that there were these very rigid patterns about, self-imposed, lots of them, about dating, so that you couldn't kiss somebody after the first date, but you could after the second date, and then you sort of got progressively further on, and then you stopped, or you got married. And that was it. It was very rigid, and I doubt very much if kids who are sexually active today would even recognize any of this. On the other hand, there were lots of kids who had sex and didn't talk about it, and or there were people who had sex and you sort of knew who they were.
We know that now.
Yeah. No, we knew that then. We knew that then, and we used to try to guess who they were, and so it was this sort of differentiation between those people who were sexually active and those people who weren't, and you tried to tell by the clothes they wore and how they walked, and it was bizarre, to say the least.
You and I both consistently use, and I notice this in every expert like you, the word rules. Yet when you go to find these rules, you can't find them written anywhere. Just simply say, what kind of rules are we talking about if they're not written in a book or codified in any way?
Well, the rules were things you talked about on the telephone with your friends, and they were imposed by your parents. Parents talked about it a lot. There were high school counselors who told you what the rules were. And even if they weren't written down, everybody really knew, and you could almost read them out, cite them. Now there were a lot of high schools that actually passed rules about not holding hands in public, and where to sit and how to sit, and how girls should sit and how boys should sit, and what they should wear and things of that sort. All of which had to do with sex. But everybody knew these things. There are lots of unwritten rules that people are very aware of. That's what society is all about. Culture is all about unwritten rules, and we had an awful lot of them.
People or the money, what gave kids power?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but part of it really has to do with the fact that children were the center of life. And parents were constantly talking about, and in fact sacrificing for their kids, trying to create a better life. This was a very serious thing they were doing. And the move to the suburbs was in part that, create a better life for my kids. And buying them things that they hadn't had in the 30s and the Depression was very important. And teaching children to be consumers and allowing them to influence consumer decisions is really I think, a kind of unique thing in the 1950s. It's not unique anymore, but it becomes unique in the 1950s. And kids had to, for example, lobby their parents to buy television sets. Lots of parents didn't want television sets. They thought that was a bad thing, that kids wouldn't read books. And they had to lobby them to buy fancy cars, and the whole movement to customize cars and create kind of outlandish designs comes, I think, from kids working on cars and these designs getting into Detroit and then being sold back to us. Also, things were a lot cheaper. Cars were almost cost nothing, and washing machines and the kinds of appliances. Now, relative to the amount people earned, it was still a lot. But if you hadn't had a washing machine in your house or a dryer in the 1930s, and you moved to the suburbs in the 50s and you bought one of these things, why, my God, you thought, this is really changing. Things are really changing for the better. You were being told, the whole society was preaching saving money and learning the value of money. I remember that phrase endlessly being preached at me. What is the value of money? The value of money had nothing to do with buying something. It had to do with not spending it. Value had to do with not using it. So you were constantly getting messages like that from school, from parents, from all kinds of places. And at the same time, your parents were buying all these things, and the society was encouraging you to purchase everything. So you got a mixed message. Like everything else in the 50s, there's a mixed message. The result of the two messages that you got in the 1950s was, one, that you were the center of the universe, and that you could change the world, and that everything revolved around you. And at the same time, you were being told not to do anything at all. Therefore, there's a contradiction, and the contradiction focuses on all the things you weren't supposed to do because you were being told not to do them, and yet you were being told to do them in a sense. And the result of the mixed messages is a kind of grandiose self that this is an old American thing anyway. My freedom is everybody else's freedom. Whatever I can do personally to break the bounds that are on me are going to liberate everybody else. And so we all thought, we persuaded ourselves, I think, that everything we did to subvert the rules of the 1950s and the patterns of life that were expected for us was something done for humanity. Very grandiose a view of the world.